Welcome to Secret Story. Dear friends, thank you very much for watching. Leave comments, put likes, share with friends and subscribe to the channel. Here is a new standalone story. Thanks for bearing with us. We have many more to catch and new ones, so keep reading. Thanks for your loyalty. Like and comment. But most of all, enjoy. The smooth summer's breeze gave the day an almost magical feel as the sun set golden over the ocean horizon of the city of taboo dreams. The soft, unwinding of another productive, relaxing, and often illicit day would soon be slowly fading into the glow of the neon lights and street lamps as the nightlife awoke. As the sun set slowly. However, a large golden-red half-ball on the horizon, the gentle breeze stirred oh so lightly. It gently teased flags and leaves as it played across the vastness of the city of Shorehaven, smiling up at the red-orange sky as the bright red Cadillac drove leisurely down the street with the top down. Mrs. Shelley Winters couldn't help but feel a tingle of magic run through her luscious 27-year-old newlywed body. She closed her eyes and let the wind stream through her long, wavy, dark brunette hair, relishing in the soft melodies the radio played and the feel of the whole romantic atmosphere of the end of another perfect day. Opening her large dark brown eyes, Shelley turned with a loving smile to look at her new husband. The man of her dreams, as he sat driving beside her, Hayden Winters. He was as stunning as the first moment Shelley had laid eyes on him 5 years ago. With his ruggedly attractive face, his styled light brown hair, his piercing green eyes, his fit and toned body, and that entrancing smile that had won her over from across the room when their eyes had first met, Hayden always made her feel so warm inside. He made her feel safe. And he made her feel loved. Oh, that had made her feel a whole lot over the honeymoon they had just returned from. That was why they were driving now, Shelley thought as she smiled deeper. Hayden looked over to her warmly, that stunning smile spreading his lips. But the fact that they had just returned from their honeymoon, they had only been back in Shorehaven a couple of days, but the house they had been considering buying had finally become theirs the day before they were due to return. And so, they had spent most of their time back finalizing all of the paperwork with the agents. Though most of it had already been done prior to. They had just received the key to their dream home that afternoon. So, after a long day, the two newlyweds were finally on their way to see their new house for the first time. The home they had planned to start their family in, which they had already begun trying for on the honeymoon. Shelley couldn't wait. She had seen the house a couple of times before. But this time it was actually theirs. All theirs. Now they could finally walk in and feel that they had a home, instead of having to stay with Hayden's parents. Can you believe the house is all ours? Shelley asked contentedly. Her fingers twirled around his as she watched the houses and cars pass by in the romantic light of the setting sun. All ours, Hayden replied warmly, squeezing her softly and bringing a smile to the young wife's pretty face. I want to decorate the front room in white, she said, envisaging in her mind how it would look when it was finished. That room had stolen her heart the moment she had first laid eyes on it, you know, the one with the big French doors. Hayden smiled and nodded. He had heard her tell him what she wanted in every room of the house ever since the drive back from their first viewing. Still, he listened as if this was all brand new to him. Oh, it will look amazing in the summer. Especially when the sun sets, she continued, picturing the room in the current light. So long as the lounge has the plasma on the wall and the marble gray below the dado rail, you can do what you want with the rest of the house, he replied, and Shelley smiled deeper to herself. She would let Hayden think it was his idea to have the lounge decorated that way. It kept him happy. Though she knew it was as much her idea as his. And it kept him out of her hair when it came to deciding on how the rest of the house would look. She loved him with every bit of her heart, but bless him, he had no artistic talent for matching colors or setting things out to look attractive. So, you won't mind my idea for the bedroom then? She teased, and grinned as her husband took the bait. Well. He began defensively, though with a large grin. He knew he had already lost that battle a long time ago, and so, the newlywed couple continued their discussion, with no new developments on what Shelley had already decided. Though Hayden was getting slightly better with his suggestions. They drove on, turning to ascend the hill that led to where their new house awaited them. As the car turned and pulled onto the driveway, Shelley felt a flutter of excitement and pride flood through her as her large dark brown eyes fell once more on the house of her dreams. It was a large bungalow, situated on the top of a large hill in Gainsborough. It was in one of the most beautiful neighborhoods this side of Shorevale Heights. And within the magical glow of the setting sun, the place really seemed like a picturesque fantasy come true. The moment the car stopped, with a wide, bright smile, Shelley excitedly jumped out and half ran to the front door, leaving Hayden to try to catch up to her with an amused chuckle. Though she did wait for him to reach her before she actually turned the key and pushed the door open with a childish grin. The house's front door led into the bungalow's long main hallway directly in front and two smaller passageways leading both left and right of the front door. Those two were almost entirely the windows of the front of the house, allowing a flood of the deepening red light to bathe the undecorated corridors in a lush, warm glow. The light painted the walls of the first rooms on either side of the hallway in a glorious light. When the estate agent had first told them that the two front rooms weren't actually connected to the front wall of the house, but instead stood a few feet back, both Shelley and Hayden had been dubious about the design, not to mention how it would look. However, after first seeing the place, and how the windows gave the space an almost gallery feel to it, that welcomed those who entered to journey deeper into the ever more amazing layout. The two of them knew they had found their perfect home, and now, as she stood there in the soft glow of the setting sun, letting her eyes take in that gallery area and the first hall that led into their new house, Shelley knew they had made the right decision. Closing the door behind them, Shelley could feel Hayden's smile, as deep as hers, as he wrapped his arms around her waist, and she leaned back against him. Her eyes glowed with pure excitement and happiness. This place was it. It was going to be their home. Their own home for them and their children, which they planned on having as soon as possible now. Well, as soon as they had decorated the place anyway, those thoughts brought both of the subjects to Mrs. Shelley Winter's newly married mind. "This place is going to look so gorgeous when it's finished," she said warmly, resting back against her new husband's chest. "You always make the right choices," Hayden replied, gently kissing her hair. Shelley drew in a deep, "I almost want to start decorating it now," she teased, knowing full well that wasn't an option right then. But still, she did feel like it as predicted, and with a small self-amused smile on her face, Shelley listened as Hayden replied. "I'll have time off next week, Shell, and then we can really get stuck in," her sweet husband said lovingly. Shelley turned with that amused smile still sparkling on her beautiful lips and wrapped her arms around his neck. "But that doesn't mean we can't get a few little bits done before then," she commented and pursed her soft lips as Hayden grinned down at her. "When have I ever been able to talk you out of anything once you've set your heart on it?" he teased, knowing full well that he was as excited to get the place done and moved into as she was. Shelley's slight smile turned into a deep grin at that as she bounced up and down on her toes. "Though we'll have to get help in to finish this place as quickly as you want it done," he added teasingly, and Shelley laughed. A soft musical sound. "Well, your dad and your brother said they'd help," she replied, as she gently stroked his cheek. "A good job too, Miss Demanding," he joked. Her eyes suddenly sparkled with a different light. "You know it, bad boy," she teased, and Hayden smiled at her deeply. "Actually," she began a little coyly, "now you mention it, this is going to be the home for our kids." Hayden nodded, apparently not having cottoned on to what she was implying. Shelley just found that amusing and cute. "And, well, we have been trying," she continued, looking up at him through her eyelashes. The meaning in her eyes now oh so clear. Hayden didn't miss this one. His face suddenly took on the dawning of understanding and appeal. That only made the newlywed wife's eyes sparkle more as her heart began to pound. "So, what do you say we christen the new house, Mr. Winters?" she said in a deeper voice. "Oh, now I think that sounds like a splendid idea, Mrs. Winters," he replied just she backed away from the door. Headed past the first rooms, and down to where the hall turned left away from what would be the lounge. Then they passed the kitchen and walked around into the rest of the house. "Here?" her husband of a couple of weeks asked restrainedly, and as Shelley nodded a week later, Mrs. Shelley Winters sat down on the edge of her and Hayden's bed that they shared at his parents' house, pulling her white-heeled shoes onto her feet. She had just gotten dressed after having a quick shower, which Hayden was now in. Taking a deep breath, Shelley stood and tried to calm her now racing heart and reddening cheeks. They had decorating to do if they were ever going to move into this gorgeous new house of theirs. Letting her breath out, Shelley brushed her long, wavy, dark brown hair over her shoulders and tried her best to focus on other things. She was going to have to pull her hair up into a ponytail before she started painting. She didn't want it to get covered. That line of reasoning went out of the window, however, the moment Hayden walked through from the bathroom. "Come on," she said as her sweet husband closed the door behind him. She sounded more than a little flustered. She was trying hard to keep her mind on the job at hand. "Or do you plan on letting me do all the decorating today?" Hayden's amused smile didn't help matters. It sent a bolt of pure electricity running through every nerve in her body. "I'll just get dressed," he replied, and with that allowed the towel to simply drop to the floor. Shelley's already sparkling eyes gleamed instantly. That was when a knock came on the bedroom door. "Hayden," came the querying voice of her husband's father through the wood. Shelley felt a mix of relief, after all they really had to get this house done, and irritation. Oh, she couldn't wait to have their own place. No more interruptions at such moments. "Yeah, Dad," her husband called. "Need to have a word, son," Hayden's father replied from outside the room. "I'll be down in a sec," her husband replied, and Shelley felt a twinge of disappointment. It looked like they'd have to wait to release that tension now, and so, a few minutes later, both of the newlyweds made their way downstairs. They were ready to head out with Hayden's father and brother to try and get as much of the house finished as possible. Well, that was until Hayden's father let them know that neither of them would be able to make it that day. Something to do with the downstairs bathroom flooding due to some shoddy plumbing work that had been done a couple of weeks ago by one of Hayden's brother's workmates' cousin's friends, that seemed to temper down the electrical charge. Shelley felt somewhat. With only the two of them, they wouldn't be able to get half as much finished as they had planned. 20 minutes later, the newlywed couple were once more heading along the broad streets and often tree-lined lanes of Gainsborough. They were debating how they were going to get the house finished by the end of the week, which seemed increasingly unlikely. That was when Hayden's mobile rang, blasting the cheesiest ringtone ever from the convertible car as they turned onto another road a couple of blocks from the new house. Hayden, of course, picked up the phone. His mirrored sunglasses glinted in the summer brightness as he leaned his elbow on the door, holding the wheel in one hand as he answered. "Yeah, hello," her sweet husband answered as brightly as ever, and Shelley smiled amusedly to herself as she brushed a strand of windswept hair away from her mouth. After listening for a couple of minutes, Hayden laughed suddenly, a broad smile on his face as he listened. "Kayaking? Are you kidding me, Connor? I'm a married man now," he replied amusedly, and Shelley's smile deepened. Connor McAllister was Hayden's long-time friend. So long in fact that the two of them had known each other in high school, back when they used to speed around in Connor's Charger, even before either of them had their license. Connor was a great guy though, incredible fun and the life and soul of any get-together, despite the fact he always skirted the edges of trouble. Though he was one of those guys that never seemed to get caught, Shelley remembered one specific story Hayden had told her on their wedding day. Connor had been one of the guests that day, along with several other of Hayden's boyhood friends, one of which had been his best man. The story had gone something like, at school Connor had managed to somehow, was lost on all of them involved, get a crate of beer. They had all sat and drunk behind the stadium stands before heading into a history class, totally out of their heads. Connor had been the only one to not get detention. All of the others had sooner or later been found out, but Connor had somehow managed to escape unnoticed. Still, the half-Scottish Connor was always planning some kind of adventure. The last time he had called, just before the wedding, Shelley thought, he had planned a sky dive for the group of friends that still hung out a lot now. That had been an experience and a half. Especially as no one had been exactly sure where Connor had gotten the plane from. That was why Shelley Winters sat smiling as she watched her husband of 3 weeks laughing while he drove and talked about kayaking. She wondered what kind of craziness Hayden's friend was planning for them this time. How about in a couple of weeks, her new husband replied to his friend, turning the car around another corner, "I can't, Connor. Me and Shelley got that house." "Yeah, you know the one on the hill." "MHM, yep, that's the one. Been trying to get it decorated so we can move in." "Yeah, we're on our way over now. Got a few bits done, but still a lot to go before we can move in properly." Hayden looked over to her. And even with his shades on, Shelley could make out the amused expression on his face at his friend, and then as Hayden finished his words, his expression suddenly changed to one of self-satisfaction as he grinned at her. He was up to something. "Say, Connor, whereabouts are you anyway?" her loving husband asked his friend. The movement of his face told Shelley he had just winked at her. Oh yes, he was definitely up to something. Shelley watched him with amused consideration, trying to work out what her sweet husband was up to. "At home, huh? And what are you up to?" he asked, a scheming grin on his face as he nodded to whatever his friend answered. "Well, what do you say I swing by and pick you up? We could use an extra hand on the house as Dad had to pull out." Shelley grinned at that and tooted. She shook her head in mock disapproval of putting his friend on the spot as Hayden looked to her triumphantly. Her husband simply grinned deeper at her playful approval. Another set of hands would prove most useful that day after all, Shelley thought. Maybe they could get the place decorated by the end of the week now. Connor was always full of energy after all. Today should go by very productively indeed, not to mention fun, if Hayden's friend had anything to do with it. Little did she know just how correct her thoughts would be. "All right then," Hayden said energetically. He always sounded vigorous when Connor was around. The man just had that effect on people. Connor had obviously agreed, no doubt enthusiastically as always. "We're nearly at the house now, so I'll drop Shelley off and I'll swing by and pick you up in a bit then." "Yeah. Oh, and don't forget to wear something old. Paint and all that." "All right, man, I'll see you soon." With that the phone beeped off and Hayden chuckled to himself as he turned the car into the road the house was on. "Looks like we'll get it done as planned after all," her husband said proudly, as he switched hands on the wheel, resting his free arm behind her. "Connor will make up for two men, knowing him." Shelley laughed lightly, that soft and musical sound, as she nodded. Both of them were unaware of the trueness those words would hold later. "Just try not to get distracted on your way back," she teased. "I don't want to be stuck painting while you two are out having fun." "Of course not," he replied oh so innocently, and Shelley smiled in return. And so, a few minutes later, Mrs. Shelley Winters found herself standing in the hallway of her and Hayden's new home with the paint. The tables and brushes were all stacked up all over the place from the previous decorating trips they had made there the last week. Well, the previous short trips they'd made, anyway. Shelley stood in the not-so-empty house, paint pots sitting around, as well as brushes and rollers, ladders and decorating tables. A couple of pieces of furniture were covered by large white cloths, such as the sofa in the lounge, or the few utensils in the kitchen. The place looked, well, chaotic. But Shelley just breathed a sigh of relief knowing that soon all of the clutter and mess would be out, and a carpet would be down in each room with beautiful furniture. At least, she hoped it would be soon. They both had work again soon. Still, even in its not-so-pristine state, Shelley couldn't help but smile and think of what a wonderful home the house was going to make for her and Hayden's kids. Now that shouldn't be too long in coming, she hoped. After all, they tried for a baby often enough. That thought made Shelley's cheeks heat, as the image of Hayden earlier suddenly flashed back into her mind. They would no doubt be trying again every day until it happened. She didn't mind the trying part at all, though standing there right then, Shelley could just see what it would all be like when it was finished. Shaking herself out of her reverie, the stunning brunette Newlywed decided that she ought to get on with something. Before Hayden and Connor came back and found her doting there like well, she should just get started. And so, heading into the first room on the right, Shelley smiled as she looked around her favorite room in the whole house. The room with the large French doors standing opposite the hallway door. Searching through a pile of rags and large covering sheets, she pulled one of Carl's old shirts from the pile. A sky blue thing spotted with various colors of paint from the last few days. Rolling up the cuffs, Shelley set one of the decorating tables up and opened a large can of white paint. Nodding to herself as she got the brushes and rollers ready, she looked around the room as she brushed her hair back with her fingers. She held it up and slipped a band on to hold her long, wavy dark brunette hair in a ponytail. Taking up a brush, she was determined to get the room done that day, even if it was somewhat large. So, ignoring the scraps of newspaper littering the floor, and the pile of rags and cloths in the corner of the otherwise empty room, Shelley loaded the brush. She walked to the wall by the door to the hall. The wall that made the other side to the lounge wall, and began to paint. The gorgeous brunette wife hadn't been painting long, though she had stopped briefly to open one of the large French doors. The fumes and slowly growing heat of the day had soon brought that idea to mind, when the sound of a car pulling up in front of the house announced that Hayden had returned with his friend. Well, that and Connor's ever-enthusiastic voice as he seemingly jumped out of the convertible rather than opening the door by the sound of Hayden's jest. Shelley listened as the keys sounded in the door before Hayden pushed it open. "Shelley, I'm back," her husband of 3 weeks called out, and Shelley smiled to herself. She liked the sound of that. "No shit, Sherlock," Connor teased his friend before suddenly a song scratched on into the background, and this time Hayden's friend announced the obvious, "And we brought a radio to liven this place up." Shelley smiled amusedly and brightened more so as Hayden came to the door, a large grin on his handsome face. "I knew I'd find you in here," he said before he leaned down and kissed her gently. "Careful who you tease, Mr. Winters," she warned him playfully, holding the paintbrush up, "or you may end up with a white nose." Hayden grinned, as did Connor as he came to stand next to his friend holding the radio in his hand. Connor McAllister, with his styled brown hair that occasionally flopped into a fringe. His enrapturing gray eyes, strong and toned though not muscular build, ever-present mischievous smile, and lively, adventurous personality, was always a presence. The fact that he was of Scottish descent also added to his charm. Especially when he had turned up at their wedding wearing a kilt in his family's tartan. Despite the fact that he knew they were painting, Connor had dressed little differently to usual. Though he did have a white and red plaid shirt on over what appeared to be a tight white vest and stone-washed jeans. His trainers looked a little painted up though, so perhaps this was his way of being prepared to decorate. "I think she means it, Hayden," Connor jokingly warned his friend. And Shelley's amused smile turned on him next. "Don't think you'll get away with it either, mister," she teased, and Connor held both of his hands up, as best as he could anyway while holding the radio in one hand. "Don't shoot." "I yield," he protested, and Shelley laughed lightly. "He was such a joker, at least I know who wears the pants in this house," he added to Hayden, and Shelley mockingly pulled a face as she flicked her wrist sending paint at him. Connor however anticipated her move, dodging behind Hayden for protection. And so, the white paint shot out and plastered the one hall wall. Shelley held her hand to her mouth to hold back a giggle. Hayden grinned, looking from the wall to her. "What color were we going to paint the hall?" he asked with amusement in his voice. "I guess white," she replied, still holding back her laughter. "Looks good," her sweet husband replied, and she laughed as he did. Then Connor peeked out behind Hayden's shoulder then. But before he could say anything, probably something along the lines of whether it was safe to come out, Shelley spoke up. "Come on, you two, stop wasting time. We've got a lot to do, so no slacking," she said, wielding her paintbrush like a stick. Hayden grinned and nodded. However, Connor, of course, couldn't miss the opportunity. "See, I knew she wore the pants," he jibed, and Shelley pursed her lips, holding back another laugh. As she held the paintbrush up again threateningly, holding his hands up, Connor smiled innocently, making sure to keep Hayden between him and her as they walked further down the hall. Once out of sight though, her husband's old friend made a comment just conveniently loud enough for her to hear. "Never mind the pants, I never knew you liked doms," he joked, and Hayden laughed. "Don't you start, Connor McAllister, or I'll show you who's a dom," she called amusedly down the hall. There was just no stopping that guy. Crazy. Both Hayden and Connor broke out in laughter at that. Shelley turned back to start painting the wall, shaking her head as she laughed lightly to herself. She would never get anything done if she carried on joking with that guy. An hour or so passed before Shelley finally managed to finish the wall she had started. Not because it was large enough to take an hour to paint, but simply because she either had Hayden or Connor coming in every 5 minutes to ask if she wanted a coffee break already. Or she was almost keeling over laughing in some of the things the three of them were saying. Or because Hayden kept sneaking in, with the excuse of needing the bathroom, and giving her sneaky kisses. Not that she minded that last, though. But she was adamant to get this place finished by the end of the week, and at this rate, she wouldn't even get this room done by then. Still, it was nice listening to the various tunes that popped up on the radio. Even if she did have a little dance along with one or two of them instead of painting properly. So alright, she was as bad as either of the guys. But still, she would get her room finished, and there was only her painting it, unlike in the lounge. That was, at least, until she suddenly caught the end of Hayden's sentence before he came walking through to her, leaving Connor painting in the lounge. "Get some on the way," he finished as he came in, shades in his hand, with a warm smile for her. "Get what?" she asked. "We're almost out of paint next door," he answered. "Oh yeah," she asked with a hint of playfulness. "Yep," he answered with another kiss, "and I forgot to bring the wood gloss over from Dad's this morning." Shelley tooted teasingly, her eyes brightening as she stared into her husband's piercing green eyes. Those feelings that had faded from earlier came back quickly as the image of that morning once more flashed vividly into her mind. "You'll have to go get it then, won't you?" she replied softly. Hayden smiled as he kissed her again gently. A faint thought passed through the newlywed wife's mind that it was a good job she had managed not to get paint on herself so far. She wasn't usually that lucky with decorating. Otherwise, her sweet loving husband would have covered himself. "I suppose so," he said. "It's a shame your friend is here." For a long moment the newly married couple stared into each other's eyes. Words going unspoken, and the room filling with enough electricity to light the house for a month. Then the moment was broken by Connor calling from the other room. "Where's the bathroom in here, guys?" her husband's old friend called from down the hall, and both Hayden and Shelley grinned at each other. When they were alone. "Follow the hall and take the second door on the left," Hayden called back. "I best get going. The sooner I'm gone, the sooner I'm back." Shelley nodded with a smile, and once more hefted her paint brush. "Yeah, you better. Or I'll never get this room finished," she replied playfully. Hayden laughed lightly as he took a step back into the doorway. "You should get Connor to help. He can't do much more in the lounge until I bring the paint back anyway," he suggested, and Shelley nodded, smiling as she let her eyes feast on the man she loved. "Grab something for dinner while you're out," she half asked and half reminded him. Then added, "And for Connor too, don't forget." Hayden nodded with a grin as he raised his shades to his face. "How could I ever forget Connor?" he joked, and Shelley laughed, nodding in agreement. "See you soon, babe." "Soon," she responded lovingly. "I love you." "Love you too," Hayden replied caringly. Then he tapped the doorframe and walked towards the front door. Both of them were unaware of how different things would be when they saw each other again. Shelley heard Connor call from down the hall. "Don't forget the paint, Hayden," he jibed good-naturedly, and Shelley could almost see her husband's amused smile. "Yeah, yeah," he replied mockingly, no doubt pulling some face or sign as Connor laughed. "You two be good. Won't be long." "Bye," she and Connor called at the same time, and then the door closed behind Hayden. Smiling contentedly, though her blood seemed to be boiling in her veins, Shelley turned to look where to paint next. She decided on the wall the door was on, opposite those lovely large French doors. The radio blared on and it was a few minutes before Connor actually came through. Obviously, he had been using the last bit of paint he had. However, as he did, he brought the radio with him, placing it on the decorating table as Shelley was behind the door painting the wall. "So, where do you want me?" he asked. Shelley half turned to look at him, and almost burst out laughing when she did, completely unaware. Connor had managed to get paint right on the end of his nose. It made him look like some kind of clown the way he was standing. "What's so funny?" he asked, and Shelley bit her lip to stop herself from actually laughing. She walked over to him and unraveled one of her shirt sleeves, holding it over her hand as she wiped the paint off his nose. "You look like a clown," she teased, as she moved back grinning at him. Rolling her sleeve up once more. Hayden's friend catoned on then and began laughing himself. He obviously imagined how funny he must have actually looked trying to appear all serious with a painted nose. "Thanks," he said when he stopped laughing. "No problem," she replied with an amused smile, as she once more returned to the wall. "You can start that side and work your way towards me. That will get this wall finished quicker." Nodding, Connor looked around himself for a spare brush, having left his other paint-covered one in the would-be lounge room. Then he loaded his brush and began painting in the opposite corner to her. As the two of them began painting, Shelley smiled to herself. She knew that she would get this room finished today. Connor McAllister always enjoyed spending time with Hayden and Shelley. They were good fun, and as spontaneous as he was in their own way. Though no one was ever really as spontaneous as him, not that he had ever met. Still, it was good fun joking and talking to Shelley while the two of them painted the wall white and listened to the radio. The 5 minutes since they had started seemed to pass quite quickly, and they managed to make quite a good headway on the wall at the same time, even if Shelley did somehow manage to start flicking a few blobs of paint on herself when she reached up. Not that she was short. It was just that the room was quite tall. And she had to stretch to reach for it and had overloaded her brush too much. Not that Connor actually really looked. He had never looked at Shelley that way. Oh, he could acknowledge that she was a stunning woman, no doubt. But he had just never looked at her any other way than as his old friend's girlfriend, fiancée, and now wife. Still, he did try to help her by offering to paint the higher places, for which she gratefully accepted. Though true to his nature he couldn't let that slide without a little bit of a joke. As usual Shelley gave as good as he did. And as the two of them drew closer to each other, their brushes almost meeting on the wall to finish it, Connor was once again glad he had nothing to do that day. Hanging out with his friends was always the best option. Little did the Scottish descendant know just how best that option would be. Hayden Winters drove contentedly, the radio playing on the same station Connor had put on while they were painting. The wind blew warmly through his hair. The day couldn't get any better as far as the newlywed husband was concerned. He had his beautiful wife, their home was coming on as planned, they were both happy, and they were having a good day with his friend. What more could a guy ask for? Turning down the road onto the highway that would take him into downtown, Hayden leaned back in the car seat and tapped his fingers on the wheel along to the tune on the radio. It was a classic song that reminded him of the days he and Connor used to cruise in the latter's Charger. Little did the husband of 3 weeks realize, as his wife and old friend were equally unaware of, what was about to unfold as Shelley and Connor's brushes swept up and down closer to each other. Little did he know what his decision to bring his friend over to help decorate, or to have him help his wife while he went out leaving them alone, had begun, that ever warmer summer's day in Shorehaven. Or what would follow after it. If he did, Hayden may never have left them alone in their new house together. As Mr. Hayden Winters drove on, blissfully unaware of events unfolding, Mrs. Shelley Winters continued painting. Impulsiveness about to lead to unexpected pleasure. Shelley smiled at Connor as she began painting the wall faster, as both of them competed to be the one to actually finish painting the last wide square on the wall. Up and down their arms moved, across and quicker, until both of them began laughing. Both began to draw closer to the last portion. Suddenly Shelley bumped her side into Connor, unexpectedly for him, though intentionally for her. He staggered back, and with swift wrist movements Shelley covered the last remaining area triumphantly. "I win," she exclaimed victoriously, grinning widely as she turned to raise her arms. "You cheated," Connor replied, and Shelley laughed in response. "Sore loser, Connor." "Ah, what a shame," she teased, and laughed. "Right," Hayden's friend said with a playful grin, as he lifted his brush. And then with a flick of his wrist he sprayed her with paint from his brush. Gasping, Shelley held up her hands as she froze for a moment at the sudden spots of white paint that coated her. Connor, meanwhile, laughed very amusedly, before he walked over to the water pot to wash his brush. "You did not just do that." Shelley gasped, as she stared at his back in playful shock. "That's what you get for cheating," Connor replied with amusement, as he stirred his brush in the water. He grinned over his shoulder at how she looked with flecks of paint covering her shirt and some on her pretty face. "Right, you asked for it," the newlywed wife retorted, then she instantly flicked her wrist, sending a large shower of thick paint blobs all over Connor's back and half-turned face. There was so much that her husband's old friend, stunned at the unexpected retaliation, twisted to try to defend himself. A clutter and clatter marked the sound of the paint pot falling over. Huge globs of thick white paint ran into the water bowl, turning the barely white water thicker and more pearly white. Stumbling back and knocking the table, Connor wiped his face as it was his turn to gasp and Shelley's turn to giggle in delight. "Now we're even," the beautiful wife said, as she watched her husband's friend stare at her in shocked disbelief. "Quits." Connor's hand grabbed his brush quickly, and once again flicked water and paint at her. This time though Shelley was able to shield herself somewhat beneath her arm as he replied. "Oh, not now, Mrs. Winters. You shouldn't start what you aren't willing to finish," he announced, and with a laugh, as she flicked her brush at him again and ran to grab the paint pot for more ammo, Shelley replied. "It wasn't me that started it." "You did," she said, as she ducked behind the table from Connor's next throw before launching her own retaliation. "Just call it quits." "I have the whole pot." "Yeah." "Well, I've got the water," he responded. Then emphasized his point with a cold splash that sent water down the back of her shirt, just missing coating her ponytail. As she tried to duck out of the way, Shelley exclaimed as the cold water suddenly soaked her back. Then she thickly loaded her brush and stood up. "Right, Mr. McAllister, you just wait," she threatened mock-angrily, as she paced after him around the table. "Now, don't be hasty," Connor said, holding the water in one hand and raising his other to fend her off. "Let's be reasonable about this." "You should have thought about that before you started this," she said warningly, a smile on her beautiful face as she came to his side of the table. "It's just like you said, don't start something you aren't willing to finish." Connor held his hand up, eyeing the fully loaded brush in her raised hand. "You're right," he said suddenly, and with a quick movement tossed some more water at her before trying to dodge out of the way. With that, the stunning newlywed brunette hefted the paintbrush as hard as she could and lashed out. Huge strands of thick white paint flung across the room to splatter the wall opposite, the floor, the rags in the corner, and Connor in the middle. The splattering of her husband's friend with large gobs of paint was short-lived, however, as Connor quickly moved. He rushed towards her with the bowl of thick water/paint in his hands. "No, no, no," she repeated, backing away from him as he moved ever closer. And then as he prepared to throw, Shelley flicked the brush at him again. Connor, caught unguarded this time, almost lost his hold on the water pot. And instead of flinging the water at her, he grabbed her wrist so that she could no longer fling paint at him from the brush. Shelley quickly tried to toss paint at him from the pot as she laughed. However, Connor, as equally amused, tipped the water pot first. Both of them tried to pull the pot their way, as Shelley tried to free her hand with the brush in it. However, neither could budge the other. That was until Shelley tried to stand on Connor's foot to make him lose one or the other. Her husband's friend, however, moved first, and she lost her grip on the paint pot. Connor must have had enough of being covered in paint, quite speckled as he was, as instead of using it to threaten her he hurriedly added that to the table behind him. Either way, Connor wasted little time in trying to pull the brush from her fingers as they both danced around in a circle laughing. Paint fell and sprayed on them, the wall, and the floor as they struggled with each other. "Give in, you've lost," Connor growled in concentration, as he tried to reach the brush with his free hand only to have Shelley prevent him with her free hand. "Never," she growled in response triumphantly, as she managed to wipe the edge of the brush on his forehead. That seemed to do it then, as Connor suddenly shifted tactics and pulled his hand from hers. Instead of reaching for the brush again, his fingers swiftly moved to begin tickling her ribs through her painting shirt. Caught off guard, Shelley stumbled and began laughing hysterically, trying to fend off Connor's fingers from tickling her. Stop. Stop, she giggled, as she gripped the paintbrush, trying vainly to push his fingers away while attacking him with the brush. Getting some of your own medicine now, huh? Her husband's friend taunted, as he managed to brush the paintbrush against her cheek. Just give me the brush and it's all over. No. No, the beautiful brunette wife giggled hysterically, as she gripped tighter. The brush was now held halfway between his and her face as she continued to try to fend his tickling assault off. Never. And so, the pair danced in a stalemate for a few seconds more, before Shelley managed to return the tickling favor with a ticklish jab in the ribs for Connor. This, however, only caused him to redouble his efforts. And once again the room was filled with Shelley giggling hysterically. Over and over the two fought to try and control the paintbrush, while trying to distract each other with tickling, spinning this way and that. Until suddenly, Connor moved, and Shelley suddenly felt herself slam against the unpainted wall opposite the one she had painted first. Trapped and unable to move, Shelley kept her grip on the brush's handle while trying to flick paint at Connor. She vainly tried to fend off his other hand, as his fingers danced along her ribs making her laugh loudly, and then, in her desperate state, Shelley began to bite out at Connor's cheek as she laughed. Trying vainly to surprise him so that he would leave an opening for her to escape. As she did, he pinned her wrist to the wall, despite the fact that the move allowed her to flick paint on him. However, it wasn't enough. Connor redoubled his efforts again, and Shelley laughed hysterically. Both of them were caught up in the moment. And then suddenly in the struggle, as Shelley bit out and Connor tried to move, their lips met accidentally, caught up in the moment. And without thinking both Shelley and Connor kissed. Neither could think clearly. Both were lost in the moment, all thoughts of the paint fight, play fighting, and who they were lost. As the paintbrush clattered to the floor, spreading more paint on the uncarpeted room. The same worked when she was, and now apparently when both she and Connor were. Hayden Winters pulled into the parking space he had managed to find in front of the hardware store and turned off the engine, just as a song he really didn't care for began its first notes on the radio. Hayden stepped out of the car and headed inside. Unbeknownst to the perusing husband of 3 weeks, back at the house he and his new wife were going to call their home, Shelley and Connor had begun throwing paint at each other. They were dodging around the room as Connor spilled the tin into the water and Shelley took advantage as she could. Connor, you're... was all the newlywed brunette could say. Her eyes widened even more at the realization. That was when she spoke. I want to feel, she said huskily, the realization that here she was, only having been married to the man she loved with all of her heart for 3 weeks, having been with him for 5 years before that, while Hayden, her husband, had gone out to get some paint and food. All of this flashed through the beautiful brunette's mind. She shouldn't be doing this, but then, that her eyes fixed on her wedding ring as it gleamed in the light. It had been only a few weeks since Shelley had been standing at that altar. It had been less since she was on her honeymoon. And now here she was. Like she had not long ago on her honeymoon. With a guy who had been at her wedding. All of this spun quickly through the wife's mind. Hayden stared, his fingers tapping on the wheel, as he watched the lights, waiting for them to change. The radio was really playing some good tunes today, he thought to himself as he glanced around at the people walking along the streets. Still, he wasn't far from his parents' house now. So, he would grab what he had to and head out for the food. Then head back to the house to help his wife and friend get as much done as they could. So, it was a good job really that the DJs had decided to play a lot of the good stuff, with everything he had to do that day and all. Watching the lights, which suddenly changed, Hayden smiled to himself as he drove on. Heading back to what soon would no longer be where he and Shelley would live. He had the paint, he would soon have the extra from the house and would grab the food and then be back where he wanted to be, near Shelley in their new home. The husband of a few weeks smiled to himself, his fingers drumming more on the wheel in time to the tune blaring from his radio. He thought of what food Shelley and Connor would like to eat, and wondered how much they would have done by the time he got back. The fact that this was his friend's beautiful wife, the woman he had only married a few weeks ago. The fact that this was so unexpected. That Hayden wasn't there, that this was their house that they planned on living in, and more so, the fact that neither knew when Hayden could come back. The newly married Hayden Winters sounded the car horn as he pulled off the driveway of his parents' house and gave his father a wave. Shaking his head, the car headed down the road. His father and brother had been working hard, it seemed, though they did have some strange ideas of how things go. Smiling to himself, Hayden wondered how his family would actually get on once he and Shelley did manage to finally move into the house. Not that he had gotten much done so far either. What with having forgotten the paint, not to mention to check how much they had before heading back the other day. Still, at least Shelley would have gotten some of her planned work done today, even without him. That was when a thought suddenly struck him. Connor was there. Well, perhaps he and Shelley might get a lot done without him, as it would have only been the two of them anyway if Connor hadn't agreed to turn up. Well, if Hayden hadn't had twisted his arm into it anyway, well, it seemed that things weren't turning out so badly after all. Shelley and Connor would get as much done as she and he would have, and he could help his family out. They would all win. Little did the unsuspecting husband know just what his arm twisting of his friend had actually led to, but then, none of the three knew just then just how much Shelley and Connor would get done without him there. As the husband of 3 weeks drove on, Hayden was blissfully unaware, and so, he waited, and finally got the food, before jumping back into the car and turning the ignition. Then, as he started the journey back to his and Shelley's new home, and then reality suddenly dawned on both of them. As reality abruptly dawned on the illicit pair, the two of them heard the front door close. Hayden Winters sang loudly to the Poison song that had just come on the radio, nodding his head as he wrapped his fingers on the steering wheel. He bopped along to the tune as the car continued down the road towards the house. The food smelled incredibly good, considering that none of them had had anything to eat that day. But he would refrain from eating any until he got back, as Shelley hadn't had anything either, nor Connor for that matter. The unsuspecting husband turned the wheel into the street before the one his house was on, and as reality suddenly dawned on Shelley and Connor, Hayden turned to kick the door closed behind him, before heading down the hall. If the sudden realization hadn't snapped Shelley out, the sudden slamming of the front door signaling that Hayden had just come back would have. Granted, he had knocked over the remainder of the paint-filled water over her and the floor, so now with the effects of their earlier paint fight the room looked a complete mess. However, Shelley had no time to think, let alone move, after that. As suddenly Hayden appeared, handsome, loving and smiling, in the doorway. A brown bag under one arm and 2 tubs of wood gloss held in his hands. Copyright 2024, all rights reserved. No part of this story can be reproduced in any form or by any electronic or mechanical means without written permission from the author. All characters are fictitious, and any similarity to actual people, living or dead, events, or locales is entirely coincidental unless otherwise stated. Dear friends, thank you very much for watching. Leave comments, put likes, share with friends and subscribe to the channel.